This conversation is so precious that we're recording it so it'll be available to you all to take back to your organizations and share with them. And as well, we'll make it available more widely as well. So welcome to the New York Community Trust Leadership Fellows. This is one of a series of monthly conversations we have on topics of importance to the nonprofit sector in New York in particular, when we try to bring together subject experts, practitioners, other nonprofit folks to gain the insights on the issues of the day. And as we say, we do this every month. Today, we're looking at the issue of COVID-19 and how it affects the 259 neighborhoods that exist in New York City. The topic is such critical importance that we've had, this is one of the highest turnouts that we've had for one of our leadership conversations, and the first that we've opened up to the wider nonprofit sector. And we're so delighted that so many of you that have not been intimately involved in the fellowship are joining us tonight. If you want to learn more about the New York Community Trust Leadership Fellows, we advise you to go to trustleaders.org. Our 12th cohort starts in April, and we're accepting registration. The main criteria is that you have to be an emerging leader in the organization and the organization has to be a current grantee of the New York Community Trust. We welcome those who have not been part of our community tonight, and we hope that you'll continue to join us in the future. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, not our existing alumni fellows community, please indicate in the chat room your organization, and of course your name, and how you heard about the program, because we spread the word out as widely as possible, and we'd love to know who in fact we can thank for contributing to the turnout. Who am I? I'm Michael Seltzer. I have the privilege of directing the Trust Leadership Fellows program since its inception 7 years ago. We're in our 7th year right now, and I also am a distinguished lecturer, which means a practitioner in residence at the Marks School of Public and International Affairs at Root College, Senior College of the City University of New York. I'm sure all of you would agree with me there could be no more serious topic for it to focus on at this moment in time in the history of the world, the history of the city, history of our communities and our organizations. To name it in a nutshell, how can nonprofit organizations mobilize their already taxed resources to meet the numerous challenges facing our constituencies as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic? Tonight, we're just taking one slice of that, as we'll be focusing on our roles in vaccine education and distribution. Shelley we're going to start out with an example of what a series of community-based organizations in Morrisania are doing right now as a way to kick off our program. And take it away, Shelley.
Absolutely, Michael. Give me 1 second to just tab over to that video. I will now share my screen with the audio in. So let's see how this
19 playing out here at the Bohegan Park, both hitting this Bronx community hard. The first line of defense, providing free testing.
Presenting World AIDS Day. It's a free community event.
Right next to NYCHA's Forest and McKinley houses in the Bronx on this playground.
You come inside the park, come with the mask.
It was a socially distanced block party of sorts with a DJ and dancing, but with an important message.
So you have NYC Laboratories that's doing free COVID-19 testing and has been since the pandemic. You also have the Alliance for Positive Change that's also doing not just COVID testing, but HIV testing for free.
The event organized by Bronx Council member Vanessa Gibson. According to the New York City Department of Health, in 2019, 26% of new HIV infections were in the Bronx. And when it comes to COVID-19, the Bronx is the borough with the second highest rate of infections in the city, with 4,356 cases per 100,000 people, compared to a citywide rate of 3,507 per 100,000 people.
This is the epidemic that we faced first in our lifetimes, okay, as a community. And now this is the second one.
We are here to provide free HIV testing and Hep C. It's only about 30 minutes it will take.
Two underlying reasons that we continue to struggle with. It's our poor healthcare infrastructure system in the Bronx, and it's also food insecurity.
Isabel Medina and Stephen Bethia came out to take advantage of the free testing.
It's good for the community.
They care about the community, and they want everybody to be aware that it's going on. So I brought my daughter here.
Am I getting tested too? These community groups say lessons of 4 decades fighting AIDS are now vital in the battle against COVID-19.
The high level of infection rates in the Black and brown communities, African American, Latino, Latinx communities, and we have to do more to raise the level of awareness, not just on World AIDS Day.
And if you want information about free testing in your community for HIV or COVID-19, just go to my Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter page at Monica Morales TV. We'll link you to those resources. In the Bronx, Monica Morales, Pix 11 News.
All right, so to kick off the new year.
Yeah, so that's, if you will, an illustration of what we're talking about tonight. How we are not really officially recognized when we, the nonprofit sector, is that we are also frontline workers. We're going to give honor to our healthcare workers that make a big difference. But the fact of the matter is that very often community-based nonprofits and citywides are the first place that local residents turn to for counsel in the AIDS pandemic and of course in this pandemic. You may recognize Council Member Gibson because she's now running for Bronx Borough President, and there was a 22-minute interview with her on Metro Focus over the weekend, which really expands on her leadership role and what she did together in the Bronx. And we'll be mailing a clip to you after this program tonight because we don't really have time to show it. So let's get back to the point. There's an old story that's repeating itself right now, right in front of us, and it's captured in one sentence. When Wall Street sneezes, Harlem gets pneumonia. And that talks about the inequities that exist in our healthcare system that structurally have that have always disadvantaged immigrants, people of color, et cetera. So let me give you some recent statistics to put a face on, what we're talking about. Currently, 27,705 New York City residents have died from COVID-19. The death toll from COVID-19 has been disproportionately high in Black and Latinx communities in New York City. Just to illustrate that, Black residents account for 28% of deaths in the city, 28%, even though they're just 22% of the city's population. Latinx residents account for 34% of deaths in the city and 29% of its population. So that just begins to show us some of the disparities of how pandemics and health problems, challenges have a disproportionate impact on our low-income communities, our communities of color, and immigrant communities within our neighborhood. Our last pandemic, AIDS, which many of us lived through and learned a great deal from, claimed the lives of more than 100,000 New York City residents, which is quite a remarkable statistic. However, one of the silver linings came out of that was that the frontline nonprofit organizations played a critical role in prevention, education, care and comfort, advocacy, and so forth. So they were primed for swinging into action, as we're already seeing many of you doing in response to this pandemic, with valuable and trusted information. We now have to face the challenge is, given the financial impact on COVID-19 that was so negative, how do we marshal the resources that are already overextended to pick up that role? Because we are not only the safety net of New Yorkers, we're the trampolines. We're the people that not only care for immediate needs, but help all New Yorkers in this area in the health sphere really regain a life of fullness and full health whenever we can. Another thing we learned from the AIDS pandemic is the institutions and the organizations that were most trusted in providing prevention education, and in this case, vaccine education, were those that were in the community. They were the hair salons, they were the barber shops, they were the faith communities, they were the unions. They all were on the front lines where people in those neighborhoods turned to for trusted education, which they trusted more than, let's say, for our discussion's sake, a commissioner of the city or the state on health coming forward and saying, this is what you should do. The question that we want to get into the weeds of tonight is, what strategies can nonprofit organizations employ in vaccine education and distribution that will work most for their particular communities? They already know the cultural and racial and ethnic makeup of their communities. They're perfectly positioned. They have regular relationships with those folks in their community. So what are the strategies they can employ? Who are the messengers that are most appropriate to those communities? And what are the messages? What are the talking points that they need to use into helping decrease what could be the death rates in their own communities? So tonight we are so fortunate that we have such an illustrious group of frontline folks themselves who are joining us to talk about these issues. I'll start going from my right. Lisette Nieves, who's to my near right, for the last 5 months has been the president of the Fund for the City of New York. And prior to that, she has been involved in the nonprofit sector for her whole career. She started at Brooklyn. Well, I shouldn't be doing all this because it's in your bio, so I won't. Ju Han is the deputy director of the Asian American Federation and an alumnus of the fellowship. Let's see, where is Jennifer? Jennifer, where are you? You're my second screen. Jennifer Jones Austin is the president of the FPWA, formerly known as the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, and one of the oldest federation, I think the oldest federation in the city. And then we have, as our moderator, Irfan Hasan. Irfan, wave at everyone if you would. He's the Deputy Vice President for Grants at the New York Community Trust, which of course is the funder of the Leadership Fellows Program. And he's director of its health and behavioral health grant making, and he will serve as our moderator tonight. For those of you who are not sufficiently familiar with the Trust, which is a long-standing institution. I think it's about to turn 100 years in a year or two of business. One of the oldest foundations in New York City. It has taken the lead in mobilizing other grant makers to respond to crises. It mobilized grant makers in response to 9/11, to the AIDS pandemic, and now to COVID-19. And we're very grateful for their work. So without further ado, you have everybody's bios. Oh, I forgot a couple things. Wait. Let's see. The other thing I wanted to say is a format. We want our usual format is towards the end to break into small breakout groups of 3 to 4, which Shelley will orchestrate. So you can share with each other strategies and answer the question, what did you learn tonight that you think you're going to take back to your organizations? Because of the large number, we're already at 69 participants, which is wonderful, and we expect more as the evening goes on. Please make free use of the chat room to pose questions, comments that you want to raise, and Shelley will moderate those and bring them to the attention of our panel. We'll start out, the format we will start out with is to invite each of our speakers to talk about how they come to this issue and what their organizations, either members of the federations or they themselves are doing. We'll then open it up for conversation with you all. We will break out into small groups and then come back for closing comments from our speakers. And let's see, I want to give a particular shout out to our staff, Shelley and Dia, who just came on from Seton Hall, University of New Jersey, as an intern, who helped put the program together. And have I forgotten anything, Shelley? Let's see. I don't think I have. Without further ado, let me invite all of you to unmute yourself and to give a warm thank you to our speakers and to our moderator and to each of us who are joining us tonight for what could be probably the most important conversation we will have all this year. So is everybody ready? Let's thank them all for being with us, and thank you all for joining us. Hi, Charles, welcome. Okay, so Irfan, well, everybody's gotten everybody's bio in advance. So Irfan, I'll now turn it over to you as our moderator for the program. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Michael. And thank you everyone for being here today. And I think Michael set up our conversation really, really nicely. So I'll just dive right into the questions with our three speakers. And because we've just come through a year where there really hasn't been a huge amount of order, the route I'll choose for asking our speakers to speak is the folks who I have gotten to know the most recently, and Lisette is the person who I met most recently. I met Jennifer shortly before that, and then Juhan before that. So Lisette, if you want to take it with the first question, and I'll read out the question, and then we'll go to Jennifer and Juhan. We've got a couple more questions after that, and then we will sort of get into sort of an audience discussion as well. So the question is sort of really, why is it important for nonprofits to engage in vaccine education and distribution?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Michael, for inviting me to be part of this, and Irfan for moderating, and my co-panelists as well. So I'd say a couple of things. Whenever we're talking about health, we're also talking about socially constructed environments and attitudes, right? And so often that is when we're thinking about a healthcare system, if you're not aware of how to communicate with a local community, if you create assumptions about that community, you can actually hinder their access to help. And at worst, you know, people have died, right? We don't have to continue to go that way. So when I thought about this question, there's something really powerful and unique about the United States. We have our challenges, but some things that are unique, and it's this incredibly diverse, complex, and well executed set of nonprofit organizations. That they are translators so often for services, and in some cases, the delivery of services themselves. And because they're based at the local level, they understand the language of local communities, as Michael said earlier. So when we're saying, why does it matter? It matters because there's a lot of things that are out there regarding vaccines, right? And you want to hear that from someone that you know, right? There's a lot of information out there of what are considered cures or if this is real or not. This is why it's so important that we have local communities buy into this. And I guess the last piece that I want to say too, and I think this is important, what we did learn from AIDS is that we know that the best way I hear someone. Okay.
So could maybe just themselves.
I can work with. Yeah, I will identify the person. All right, I found it. Thank you. All right.
No problem. No problem. So one thing that we realized about that too is that what built a level of trust, engagement, and support and belief in the healthcare system were local churches, were local nonprofits, and others. And we should not be surprised that this is the same kind of strategy that we should be doing today. I think it's a shame that we're waiting so long to do that. Every time I hear a halted or slow vaccination rollout, it drives me insane because I know we have the providers that can do that, right? I know we have the will to do that. So how's that for just starting the conversation?
Great, thank you, Lisette. Jennifer, same question to you. Why is it important that nonprofits, and I would say federations in your case, and their members are really on the ground on this work?
So again, as Lisette shared as she began, I too am delighted to be with you all this evening, and I greatly appreciate you all convening this illustrious group, 71 strong now, Michael, and we keep growing, and I'm glad to see that, because the more conversations that we have like this, the better informed we all are to go to our respective communities. And by respective communities, I mean the places that we work, the places where we may socialize, even if still on Zoom right now, and then our families and our friends. We need to be talking about, COVID-19 and the vaccine, the value add and the challenges, wherever, whenever, however, because we're all in this together. What we know about COVID-19 and what we know about the vaccine is that if we do not establish herd immunity, we're going to be at this not just for the next 6 months, the next year, but for the next 2-3 years. That's what they're telling us right now. They're actually even going so far now as to tell us that even with the vaccine, we still may be at this for a few years because of all the variants that are now popping up. So what's most important right now is to appreciate that we can't afford for immigrant populations, for low-income Black and Brown and other persons to be left out of receiving information and access to the vaccine. And as Lisette said, and all of you know, who is better? There is nobody, there's no organization that is better than those who are on the ground in the community, having already established themselves, individuals in the organizations on the ground, be they the leaders of the organizations, the caseworkers, the social workers, the security personnel, the persons who help clean the facilities. Nobody better than those individuals to talk with people in the community about what is happening and how this virus is impacting us most, and how this vaccine is a source, a good response to addressing and overcoming, combating this virus. The concern that I have right now is that the hesitation, the distrust, the lack of information extends well beyond the individuals and families who are moving through our communities, who are in need of services and supports, and who have come to the community-based organizations time and time again to receive them. The distrust, the lack of information, the hesitancy also rests in the community-based organizations themselves, among the workers, among the leaders. There's a great deal of work that has to be done. It is not just the people who are in need of services who are without the information. It's the CBO leaders themselves who are hesitating to engage. We've got to do the work of ensuring that everybody has the information needed to make an informed decision. We've got to do the work of helping the CBO leaders and staff persons to understand the science, to understand issues of access, and then equipping them with the information and the tools that they need to get engaged and to help those that they're serving get engaged. We've got a big problem. It's not the case right now that the CBOs have the answers. They need the support too, and we've got to do our best to help them get it.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Ju, same question to you. From your perspective, why is this so important?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to speak, Michael, and thanks to my fellow panelists for points they brought up that I agree on and I'm built on. So for us, we serve the Pan-Asian community. So that's 20 ethnic groups, 36 some odd languages, a number of other dialects that aren't counted. So for us, when we talk about the importance of nonprofits engaging in vaccine education distribution, I know some of our members and partners are on here. It's something that they're doing already. With our community members, 70% are immigrants, 50% have limited English proficiency. So that does mean that the information that they're getting, which is so fast changing in this pandemic, they're really relying on our organizations to be able to access real-time information, or, in fact, information might be a bit delayed, right? Because the burden is falling on a lot of CBOs to provide that interpretation and translation. And Lisette brought this up too about the trusted relationships, right? There's different histories that our immigrant communities have. Some of them are not trustful of government agencies. There are some folks who are undocumented. Under the Trump administration, there's been a lot of trust that has been eroded with government agencies. So for them, getting access to information, one is very much about how do I get access in the language that I speak? But two is, how do I also get information from an organization or from folks that I have relationships with, so that I know that I'm not getting wrong information. So, and for us, when we look at, I know we'll talk a little bit about the numbers that the city released around who has been vaccinated so far. Sometimes looking at those numbers you can kind of create a narrative that may not necessarily be accurate. There are some folks in our community who are receptive and are more than ready to get a vaccine. That just access has been a terrible issue, I think, for so many of our communities. But then there are also organizations, community members, like Jennifer said, that where the lack of information is maybe adding to their sense of fear or just kind of anxiety, just because COVID has, there's just been so many unknowns with this pandemic. So I think for us, like so many of our groups out of necessity are already playing that role of distributing information in language. But I think for themselves too, the frontline folks are themselves being educated about what this vaccine is about, how to access it, what is the accurate information they can provide. So very much, I think the role that they play has always been in times of crisis. After Hurricane Sandy, after 9/11, they've always had to be the bridge between the services and also the community members.
Great, thanks, Ju. Before I get to some of the other questions and before we get to our sort of shared discussion, sort of in an effort to kind of make this as inclusive as possible for, an intimate conversation of 71 people, I'm going to ask if Shelley can send out a poll, and this is a point that you just made, around who is already active in vaccine education. It would be helpful to us to know which of you are in organizations that might be working on that. So the wonders of Zoom, Shelley, if you could send the poll, and then we'll get to the next question.
Absolutely. So I've launched the poll, and I believe as soon as everybody votes, I can make the results public.
So great. And while folks vote, when we were planning the session, we had a bunch of questions that, I was going to ask, and I certainly will try to get to them, but our speakers already sort of raised a few points that have me thinking in an effort to really make this a conversation. I'd like to actually go back to something Jennifer said, which was that there is hesitancy still within our organizations and within often our organizations' leaders. How do we sort of start to get to addressing some of that before we can then become effective messengers ourselves? Because it's hard to deliver a message if you aren't fully on board with the message yourself, and that just struck me as something that's really, really important. And in the sequence of things, obviously has to happen before we can start to message out.
So FPWA is a social policy and advocacy organization. And the way that we operate is by having, if you will, one foot on the ground in the community with better than 170 nonprofit human service agencies and faith-based organizations as partners, and then one foot in the corridors of government buildings, working with city and state and increasingly with federal government leaders. As it concerns COVID, we've done just that. When we first began with the COVID response, we were, the liaison and moving back and forth between the nonprofits to identify the needs that were presenting, everything from the lack of PPE equipment to the need for greater funding for emergency food supports, for cleaning equipment, and then going to government and saying, this is what the nonprofit sector needs if they're going to stay up and running to help deliver services. Right now, what we're doing with vaccine information, awareness, and dissemination is being at the city and the state level with the governor's office and with the mayor's office, and I personally with a national task force centering on what is the community saying and how do we translate their concerns to the authorities who are making the decisions about where the vaccine goes, how it goes, how quickly, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that we're hearing is that, we found a way to ensure that the nonprofit community would be included sooner rather than later as essential workers. So you get included to be, like level 1B or tier 1B for vaccinations. And then we learned from CBO leaders that they can't get their staff to go and take the vaccine. They can't get the take-up. And what we're learning is that they've been traumatized. Being on the front line, delivering these services, seeing the devastation that it has caused, and being, in the thick of it, one might think that they would run to get the vaccine, but it's actually having a different effect. Who do they trust? Who can they themselves trust? When government let them down, when they didn't have PPE equipment, but they were still being told they had to go out and work in the community with people and not be protected. When they weren't getting, time and a half, if you will, or, like before their services and their supports when they were working extended hours, they've lost trust. They're hesitating. And so now we have to do the work of meeting them where they are, helping them to understand we see the trauma. We understand the genesis of it. Let's work through that. And then let's talk specifically about this vaccine. We're hearing from the home health aides. We're hearing from the caseworkers that, you know what, I've been using my mask for the last 10 months and it's okay. I don't know what's in this vaccine and whether or not I'm going to get sick 3, 4, 5 months out after I've taken it. The government said that they wouldn't have something before 14 months. And all of a sudden something pops up in 9 months. I can't be certain. So what we're trying to do is work through what we're seeing as trauma, as post-traumatic stress that doesn't even allow us to get into the information building. You know what I mean? I can't talk to you if your mind is not really active to hear, is not ready to hear what I'm going to say because of the trauma. So we're looking at those issues. And then we're trying to figure out who are those credible messengers, other community-based leaders, community leaders, faith leaders, and others who they turn to, who are saying, we're taking the vaccine. We've gotten the information. We feel comfortable with it. We're confident with us, so that they themselves can have their trusted leaders who they can then, respond to and then get greater confidence to take it to then be a resource for people in the community. But there's work we've got to do internally first.
Shelley just shared the results, and I think it's the good news, I would say, is that almost majority, if I've got my math right here on the fly, close to, I guess, almost 90% would like to be active. Some of them are already active, others would like to be, and that I think is really, really good news. So, and it helps give an idea around who's around the table today and just now, and that is helpful too. So moving on a bit, Lisette, can you maybe talk a bit about why are nonprofits such key trusted deliverers of the message? You started to touch on it, but from your perch where you have so many nonprofits that you work with, maybe speak a bit about that.
Sure, and I want to add something also to what Jennifer said, which I think it's linking to that, which is this: we're also at a time where we have to accept an enormous amount of cognitive dissonance around this, right? And this part is really frustrating, right? So you're saying you want me to come in to work and to work on the front line, but the schools aren't open. So what does that mean? But then I can't go here, right? There's a lot of mixed messages that people have to sort out. And I think that what happens with, at least at the most local level, is that there are some levels of trust where you could say, yes, we don't have the whole story, but this is part of the story we need for you to do too, right? It has to be visible. I will give an example, and this is where the nonprofits do matter, and I would say the faith-based institutions as well, right? Because we definitely have portfolios where they overlap. And one thing that I think is pretty significant is that we saw a greater uptick when we saw seniors going to faith-based organizations as a lead in some way. All right, that says something to you, doesn't it, right? That says something. I just throw that out there because I think that's an interesting one too, which is where is trust? Where do people feel that they're, so that's one. When I look at the portfolio at the fund, we have a significant amount of organizations that have also done in-home services that cannot do those in-home services right now, and had to figure out how to go remote. I know Jennifer's dealt with this, Juice dealt with this as well too, right? And the kind of relationship building that you can have in person is hard to translate in a remote environment. So that just means we have to figure out how we can get closer, but people are doing it. And then the second thing is we have to really elevate the work of federally subsidized clinics. And then that is where we can work in partnership with them, because particularly for those who are undocumented or have mixed immigration status, they're able to get services and support there without question in ways that they may not in other parts of our healthcare system. I'm just putting that because that's an important piece. But if you're in Corona, you want to go to Plaza de Sol, but you want to go there because you're also linked to this other nonprofit. I'm just giving an example, right? Versus going to maybe some other institutions. So when I think of the fund and I think of the organizations and why the nonprofits matter is A, they're flexible. B, they realize this idea of proximity as important for communication. And C, they understand urgency. Where I think we need to think broader and why it's important to use a convening power that we may have is there are a few other issues that aren't covered in here, which is the cost to facilities to actually do this kind of work. We haven't talked about that. What does that mean, right? What does it mean to make sure that we have the care for that, right? What does it mean if Jennifer says if we can't model that we've taken the vaccine? Let me tell you, that makes a huge difference for the rest of the team if they see you take it, right? If we can't model that, that's another piece that makes a difference. And then the other is this piece around who is allowed to administer the vaccine. I think we're still thinking narrowly. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to what I call a vaccine corps that could be happening right now, where we could have many people doing this. If we had the political will to do this, we could be doing this in every single neighborhood right now, and it would be through hosted CBOs.
Thanks, Lisette. That's very thoughtful, and I think does get to hopefully some of the questions we'll have as we sort of wrap up the broad discussion here. We have about 5 minutes left before we want to open this up to everybody else's questions as well. And I'll end with one more question to Ju, and that is, can you maybe give a few examples of some of the things organizations have already done or can easily do to help promote vaccine confidence and education? And then after that, we'll open it up to everybody else who's on the call before we go into small groups.
Sure. I think it's what our groups always do, right? Is that they integrate messaging into existing programs, right? We have our work that we have done around increasing capacity around culturally competent mental health services. Our groups have been integrating mental health concepts into like youth programs, into senior wellness services, so they've been doing that. So we have some programs where we work with different member organizations, and they've been doing work around vaccine information since COVID began, right? We should also at some point talk about digital divide, because so much of this is online, where our communities don't either have access to internet or digital services, and a lot of our seniors don't have access to those things. So I'm talking about those folks who can actually access those virtual platforms. They're able to, in their ESL classes, in their just workshops around, things around just like senior wellness, if they're able to get their seniors on these platforms, they talk about all this information. So this is already sort of ready ways that our groups are already distributing information. And a lot of our groups, you know, they've been open for much of COVID. They have regular food pantries. So they're using every opportunity they can to have in-person interactions with their community members to distribute information about the vaccine, about, you know, information where they can actually register. But I think too, is that one thing that I really do appreciate that Lisette pointed out is the amount of sort of burden this places on nonprofits, the amount of cost, right? That sort of invisible labor that none of us are getting funded to do. A lot of our groups are, you know, one person said that one of our staff members tried to register for the vaccine because she's in the high risk category. And it took her 50 different steps for her to get to the registration point. So you imagine as somebody who can speak English to do that, like the amount of work that one client who can't speak English, that our frontline staff are helping them to register. It's just an immense amount of labor on top of the crisis management that's already happening during COVID. But innovation, I think that really does come from our community-based organizations. Like one of the things that we've been, our ED sits on the state's task force, and a lot of innovative sort of thinking is coming from CBOs, right? So some of the low-hanging fruit that we've been encouraging like city and state to think about is seniors in public housing, right? Seniors, we have the poorest senior population in New York City. There's so many of them in public housing. There's this requirement of having a 5,000 square foot space to be able to vaccinate folks. But if you could have people who can come, who live in this housing, and you could have less than 5,000, but have maybe in 30 to 60 minute intervals to come in and get vaccinated 3 or 4 at a time, do you really need a 5,000 square foot space? We also have doctor networks like Somos and Kaipa of doctors who are willing to administer vaccines. So why can't they're willing to be activated as soon as there's vaccines readily available to give to our community members? So why can't we partner with those networks of doctors to actually utilize spaces, even like if we want to do large sites, people are not going to be going to stadiums. Like no one I know in the Asian community is going to be trekking up to the Yankee Stadium to be able to get vaccinated. Why not partner with mosques and churches that have big spaces, partner with groups like Kaipa and Somos to be able to administer these vaccines and use the resources that are already available in the communities, instead of saying, you know, if you build it, they'll come. Why don't you go local and really ensure access if we're talking about equity?
If I may just jump in here real quickly before we go to questions and further dialogue. Some of that is already happening. And what we're finding is that it's coming to the community and the community is still not availing themselves of the vaccine. I'll give you a great example. There is a church in Brooklyn, an historic Black Baptist church that has been for decades now, essentially like kind of the epicenter of social justice organizing and movement building. I know because my father pastored it for 43 years, and he was, you know, the co-founder of the Progressive National Baptist Convention with Martin Luther King Jr. He ran the New York chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Operation Breadbasket, which was the economic arm of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We got the vaccine we got a pop-up site in the Bedford-Stuyvesant community at Bethany Baptist Church. Right? 500 vaccines on one day. The take-up rate among Black Americans in that community was extremely low. They were called and said, come on in. And they said, no, not me. I'm passing. I'm waiting right now. So it's happening. There are churches in the Bronx, there are churches in Queens where they've been doing some of this pop-up work, and it's not necessarily like, you know, triggering that immediate response. There's a lot. We have to also keep in mind that as we're engaging with community, not all communities are the same. And the hesitation, the skepticism, access is a big issue. And as Cynthia, I believe, noted, in some places we get people who are reared up, they're willing to go. And then there aren't they run out of the vaccines, and people, they become despondent. But in some places it's there. But because of historical discrimination and continuing discrimination in our healthcare system, especially as experienced by Black Americans, it's not as simple as just popping up a site You have to deal with that trauma. You have to recognize it, you have to acknowledge it, and you have to have trusted, credible messengers to help walk through it. And it may take some more time. What the state government is saying right now, this is something that should scare us all right now. They're saying that in about 3 to 4 weeks, we're going to have more vaccines than people are willing to step up and take. And those vaccines are going to go to waste. They're going to try and stand them up at the local armories, at the shelters, at NYCHA. They've already been doing it at NYCHA. Putting CBOs going door to door. And people are saying, no, thank you. So we've got to understand it's more than just, can we create the messengers? We've got to deal with some of the underlying issues.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point to get us to jump off into the conversation. I think we have the capacity where you can unmute yourself and ask the question. We'll do this for about 10, 12 minutes, and then we'll maybe do a check-in and see if people want to go into small groups or just continue the discussion. I think there are merits to both. But who wants to be the brave person to kind of ask the first question?
May I?
Irfan, if I could also point out, sorry, we have questions in the chat room that that also Shelley can convey to you. Sorry, Dana.
I work for the New Sanctuary Coalition. I'm an administrator. We serve only undocumented immigrants. And when I have a public health background, when I announced to staff that we need to start the process for that image, every one of the affected individuals on our staff said, I will not have a vaccine. And it's not just, as I put in the chat, it's not just knowing about the Tuskegee experiments. They know what happened in their home country by USAID and other policies of US government. I'm the only one who's qualified to get a vaccine because of my age right now. So the rest of the staff can't be models because they're not, we've been remote since March. I think we're never going to go back because of what Jennifer said in terms of both vaccination and herd immunity. But I don't know what to do. I mean, I'm prepared to, in fact, I'm thinking I'll tap into many of you here, but I have my own staff, the people that relate most to the community we serve, who are absolutely adamant. And I think that's the single most, because I think there will be enough vaccines around. I mean, I've seen the over 65 population, they're complaining about the websites and all that, but they're all getting appointments and finding ways to do it. But to me, this is the single most critical issue. And anyway, any of you on this 70 people here have an idea, I'm game, but I'm just sure that we're not going to get anywhere with just education.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Taisha Jackson. I'm Executive Director of Incredible Credible Messengers, a nonprofit that supports women and returning citizens coming home from prison through restorative practices and trauma-informed care. And, you know, we work in the community. Since COVID hit, we do a lot of work with, you know, women that's maybe out doing sex work and giving out hand sanitizers and masks and stuff like that. But one of the things that I wanted to say is with Jennifer, I agree with Jennifer. I like some of the things that she was saying when she's talked about the trauma that has affected the Black and Brown communities and some of how we need to address some of these things first in order to get their buy-in to certain things. Me, I'm also a formerly incarcerated woman, and I grew up, my mother didn't like medicine, and I didn't like medicine, and it's because of some of the historical experiments and some of the historical, you know, just the social constructs and medicines, health, inequities against Black and Brown people, you know, so taking some certain medicines, you know, we fear taking certain medicines because we felt like we've been targeted. Our health has been targeted, our families and our communities. And so You know, when you go inside of these communities, like you said, you just can't go inside. Me going inside an all white community sometime at any point would be, you know, it'd be odd. It'd be odd for me. It might be odd for the people living there. And, you know, when you move in somebody's community, you know, you bring pie, you know, some people offer pie, some people welcome. And, you know, you want to build trust and relationships, you know, you want to build trust and relationships before you go out into communities and try to offer them something, knowing that this is something that has might have directly impacted them negatively in the past. You know, in my organization, one of the things we work on first before we give anybody anything is building a relationship. You know, building a trusting relationship, and it may take some time. And you want to use the people that live there, that's close to them. You know, people want to. People believe people that as probably going through the same things that they're going through, maybe come from the same communities or whatever. And she mentioned credible messengers. And, you know, that route, even though it seems like we're doing all the work, we have ties to the community all in different ways, you know? So even trying to say nonprofit organizations that's doing the front work and that's out there, a lot of us has changed since COVID has started. And it's not just about the people that we service. It's not just about us, it's about the people that we service. So when you think about the vaccines and getting the word out, we want to, in my program, we want to create leaders, right? We want to create these we want to help these formerly incarcerated people that's coming home into this chaos to be able to be educated and share this information as well. I don't believe in medicine, but if it's going to save my grandmother, my child, or someone else in my community, I want to encourage them to do what you need to do for yourself with the education, with knowing the education, and be able to give that out. Now, the thing is that we have these vulnerable populations, very vulnerable populations that a lot of people won't address because they don't care, right? You got the gang, you know, our young men, Black men and brown men that's being targeted and that are affiliated in these gangs can't go into certain neighborhoods, you know, that I'm not even trying to hear what you're trying to say there. So it has to come from someone that is going through the same thing they're going through or live close in their neighborhood. How are we getting to that population? And then also how we get into the population of the mentally challenged, right? And these poor, low poverty neighborhoods.
Right.
You know, who's addressing them and how are they addressing them, right? So we have to get people to kind of, we have to be willing to say, okay, for instance, I'm gonna use my organization. Since COVID, right? I transport women to and from prison, about for their families to visit them, pick them up when they come home, right? Help them through restorative practice. Okay, so now it's COVID. This is what it's looking like. I need all my women tested, right? We need a vehicle, plexiglass, because we want everybody who comes to come in safe and go out safe. The difference between AIDS and COVID is we know how that's contracted, right? We don't know how COVID is contracted. So everybody needs to stay safe, right? And that needs to be, we need to be able to show that, right? The funds that we get from funders and government agencies that support nonprofit organizations, a lot of them don't pay for campaigns, right? So, you know, it's always a limit to what we can do. You understand what I'm saying?
Right. And you know, if I can just interject and say, Taisha, that you're making so many great points. You know, the irony of this moment right now is that in order to get beyond COVID, we need the low-income communities of color to be vaccinated at high level percentages. But we've got a situation right now where this nation has discriminated and treated in such disparaging manner communities of color and low-income persons. And now all of a sudden you want to act like you're riding for us, right? That's the mindset. Now you want to act like, you know, oh, you care about us. What do I trust? How do I trust me? We are hearing from Black and brown people. You didn't care about me when I had AIDS. You still don't care about me when I have AIDS. You don't care about my Black women dying. You don't care about my children being undereducated. You do not care that we are living in dilapidated, environmentally challenged housing. You don't care that my wages are subpar and that I have to work 2 and 3 jobs in order to make ends meet. And now I'm supposed to trust you that this vaccine is going to do something for me.
Now, if I've seen a few of you standing, if I've seen a whole bunch of white people in front of the project saying, vax blacks, vax blacks, vax blacks, vax blacks, that would change my mind. I don't give money to a campaign. They don't give nonprofit organizations money to a campaign. And we need you. We need, you know, we need that trust. We need to say, like, why? Why is the urgency? Why am I important to you?
I'm just saying, and what Taisha's saying is you've got to undo that. You've got to get through that.
Yes.
I think.
May I say something? Or are we raising hands?
Yeah, I had saw a couple of hands raised earlier. There's Herbert and Andres, and then May. So maybe we can go in that order, trying to make sure I keep it going. So.
Thank you. I work for the Correctional Association. Since the pandemic began, we've been into 4 different New York State prisons, conducting monitoring our conditions and operations, and we aren't considered essential workers at all. But my question is, with this COVID-19 rescue package that Congress is currently debating, are there funds earmarked for organizations like our, you know, that are on the street, you know, for communications purposes? Because I've noticed they know they have a communication problem to get to seniors, to get to low income work, you know, low income people and people in the neighborhood. And I'm just curious, is anybody aware of any funds that they're going to have available as part of that $180 billion or $170 billion in this COVID relief package for community organizations to assist in communication and, you know, with spreading the word about vaccinations? Another thing, our organization sent in thousands of vaccine hesitancy surveys into New York State prisons. The response we got from docs, they stopped them. They stopped the surveys. My executive director is currently getting in touch with the governor's office and trying to get those through. But, you know, in New York State prisons is this, you know, there's right now there's over 33,000 of them. The majority, you know, we have a history of experimenting on prisoners, especially Black and brown prisoners. So a large group is not going to take this vaccine from the information we're getting. You know, we try to get that survey out, not only to find out where that number is at, but then to find out also as part of the survey, what would convince them to take the survey, you know, and, you know, we're trying to get that information out to assist in vaccination and, you know, especially as a vulnerable population as the incarcerated. But yeah, my question is, does anybody know about any funds that are going to be available in this new COVID-19 package? Thank you.
So before we go to Andres, is there anyone who might be able to answer Herbert on that? Or if not, we can certainly loop back and do some research. I think it's still a package that's changing, but
it's still a package that's changing, but they have included some kinds of supports for states that then states make the decision of how they want to do that. I think that's important, right? That this is where you really push on the state to make the distinction that we need to be prioritizing that. And I just want to say this, if unfortunately I have to go and teach a class, I think there is this piece that we have to acknowledge is people who have often not felt power. When their only power is to say no, that's when they're going to exercise it. And that's what this vaccine is representing for many communities. So we can't ignore that. I think the other part is that I have to say, even in my family too, I took my mother, a 75-year-old, to get vaccinated. And I wonder if I didn't take her, what would she have listened to on Spanish media or Facebook about vaccine? I'm just putting that out there, right? So this, I think this is, so because we're one of the states that had some of the best compliance, had the least restrictions. So I can't even model to my staff around the vaccine. And yet I would expect them to have the vaccine. This is a challenge in trust and community building that I think we can't ignore this, right? Others have done a better rollout. And let me tell you, these weren't places that were pro-vaccine. So that's
Thank you, Lisette. And I know you do have to leave, so thank you for those thoughts. I think Andres had his hand up, and then May.
Thank you so much. I'm at the New York Hall of Science. We started this organization called the Elmhurst Corona Recovery Collaborative, which is a group of 20 nonprofits working in Elmhurst and Corona to do all kinds of things with COVID-19. We're just about to launch. We're just about to launch a whole series of town halls, and I have two questions. One is, I'm wondering if this group could put together a list of folks who can speak the language of our community. We have a very densely populated community, mostly first generation Latinx, as well as a growing population of Asians who are coming over from the Flushing side. So I'm wondering if there's a list of folks from those communities that are leaders in those communities that can speak about the vaccine and its safety. That's the first question. The second one is, I think Janet, I hope I'm getting that name right, Jennifer, pardon me, talked about how it's important to get vaccines into these nonprofits. And they were at first arranged with some of the local nonprofits, and then they were moved to places like Citibank, Citi Field, pardon me, so that they can do these mass things. And it's just not logical as to how things work. We have no idea who's making these decisions. It's just one day, one day it's happening at the Queen's Theater and the next day it's happening at Citi Field. And to someone's point, no one's going to line up at Citi Field, with 3,000, 4,000 cars to get a vaccine. So I'm just wondering how that happens and how this is working and who's paying attention to whom.
So I can give some information on that. The first is your question about, are there people? So at the moment, there are people within the city's Department of Health and Mental Hygiene in the Center for Health Equity who have been designated to be able to engage with communities, of different nationalities and national origins, races, ethnicities. And so I can do some follow-up and get to Michael the email for the contact person for that. The second thing is that what they're doing right now, as I understand it, there is going to be the Citi Field vaccination site. There is going to be something at Yankee Stadium, but they're also working on how do they get into specific communities, continue to have these pop-up sites with with churches, with community-based organizations. The challenge that we have right now, part of the reason why they're going to some of these big sites is that they can bring in these refrigerators that will refrigerate and they can keep the storage there. Not as easy to do in the pop-up site in the local storefront church. And so that's why they keep, my understanding in the conversations I've had with them is that's some of why that is happening. But they're gonna, what I'm being told is in like a matter of weeks, it's gonna be access in many ways wherever you can, but the real concern is, are the people going to come? Herbert mentioned that he works for the Correctional Association. Here in New York City, our COPA members are saying no go. As a body, we're not doing this. We're not taking the vaccine. In our hospitals right now, the healthcare workers, a great many of them Black and Latinx, are saying, I'm not doing it. We've got a real issue.
Thank you. May had her hand up, and then I see Brian's hand up as well.
Hi, good evening. So my name is May. I'm with May Lee. I'm with the Chinese Progressive Association, and we're in Chinatown in Lower Manhattan. And in our community, there are people who are really eager to get the vaccine, but they, it's not like they're going to hit the you got to like hit the website, sit there and hit the website, for hours and hours before you get a vaccine. So it's frustrating. I mean, there are senior buildings with people 65 to 100 and over. The managers of the buildings are like, you know, eager to have someone come to their building and vaccinate all these people. It's practically like a nursing home in there. We also have undocumented who are just afraid to come forward. We have some people who are hesitant because, not because there's a long history necessarily or a distrust of the government, but you know, it came out pretty fast. There's all these variants, you know, there's these side effects, and they just want to wait a little bit and see. And then, but at the same time, you know, the city tells you, you know, it's easy, just hit the website. But when you hit the website, you can't get an appointment. So there's like a little circle going around here. And from what I've been hearing, what everyone said, is to hear that the thing is that it needs to be a differentiated approach and messaging and education. You can't go to the Black church and put a pop-up site there if they have this long history of, you know, like being experimented upon with these vaccines, right? So something else needs to be done first, but it's not being done. Maybe there are some communities like that senior center in Chinatown, they need the vaccination now, and the seniors want it and the management wants it, but they can't get it. So then in that case, you just send the pop-up site there. But no one's doing that, and the city isn't doing that. You know, I go to these meetings with the state and the federal government and the city, and they're all very nice, but it's not happening. And I was wondering if this group is looking to sort of make that happen a little bit more. So I'm specifically talking about the differentiated approach. And I also wish they would change the current system where, you know, it's like you go and get it, right? So, but I don't know if maybe that's another conversation.
Thanks, May.
So I asked the question.
Great. And we'll work on figuring out, I think though your point being that it does need to be an effort that is tailored to community and to need, and a one size fits all is unlikely to be the solution. It's balancing between hesitancy, misinformation, access, all those variables. I see Brian has his hand up, but before Brian asks his question, I realized we're like at 7:10 and we never got into small groups, and I don't want to undo an agenda that may have been carefully planned, but my sense is we're having a good conversation, a good intimate conversation here between the 60 of us. So if folks are game for that, we can continue, but if you feel that you really do want to go into a small group, maybe just text Shelley, and then if there are enough folks doing that, we can then do that breakout. Or Michael, do you have any thoughts about whether we should go small group or stay in the conversation we're in?
I agree with you. This is an intimate conversation. Let's compromise. Let's check in again in 10 minutes, because I think the main purpose of the small group is to say, what do I want to take back to my organization? And what I'm hearing a sentiment which we didn't anticipate is what we can do collectively. And so May and others have given suggestions there, which is an interesting thing for us to think about, which we haven't thought about.
Thanks, Michael. Brian, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. And this conversation has been really good. So I'm the deputy director of an organization called Exalt that works with teenagers that are in the justice system. Our staff is about 90%, Black or Latinx identified. And, there has been a lot of reluctance for our staff to want to take the vaccine. And we are looking through our sort of legal obligations, but also, responsibilities around trying to vaccinate them. Because based on my understanding, there are also 2 vaccines that are out now that certain youth cannot get if you're under the age of 18 or under 16, although we'll see with the Johnson & Johnson if that'll be open for all ages. But this whole idea that we can phrase this as something that is protecting our young people or protecting our elderly citizens, while understanding that, yes, as a Black man myself, I'm extremely skeptical of a vaccine that is coming down from the state. But I do also understand that it's this vicious cycle. And if we're not willing to have the courage to try to do it and to take the lead on it, that again, will lead to more death and even more loss and tragedy and trauma in our communities. So I just wanted to pay a nod to all the comments that have been made, second it, say that I'm definitely on board to be a credible messenger for those kinds of messages, to talk to our staff, talk to other people about understanding completely where that feeling comes from. But how do we sort of differentiate the valid concerns that we have over historical and contemporary things that are going on versus straight up misinformation. Misinformation that might be coming from like troll farms in Russia or wherever, right? And the way that that misinformation campaign becomes like a pariah on our community. So I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that, because I think making that distinction really clear is going to be essential to save lives, and we need to save lives. The other thing I just want to throw out there and hear people's thoughts on is, you know, so many staff are working remote during the hybrid time. So folks have left New York City. Some of our staff are now in like Chicago or Texas or Atlanta. This is such a hyper localized process of vaccine rollout. So, you know, it's sort of been alluded to, but, you know, how is it going to be different when you have some staff that might be in Georgia right now versus New Jersey versus Brooklyn? How do we make sure we get our staff the access they need to vaccine if they're willing to take it and when they're willing to take it, considering how different access is across those state or municipal lines? So I just want to hear some folks' thoughts about that, because that's something we've really been grappling with on our end.
Thanks, Brian. I think we can certainly put some of the suggestions into the chat box and also come back and talk about them. I also see Nancy Miller has her hand up. So Nancy.
Hi, Irfan. I wanted to bring up the issue of access for people with disabilities. And we particularly work with the blind and visually impaired population, but also people that are multi-disabled. Amongst my staff, many of whom are blind themselves, we did a survey and 67% of our staff are ready to take the vaccine as soon as they can get it. About 3% said maybe, 21% said not now, but possibly later after they see the results. And very few said no, absolutely. More than half my staff are people of color, mostly Black and Latinx, and they feel that they've gotten enough information from the coverage to feel safe. But the clients that we work with always have difficulty getting information because of their vision loss, because a lot of the information is not available easily except through general television coverage. A lot of the information that they get is word of mouth, and word of mouth, as we know, is not always very reliable. Most of the people that we work with are poor and they don't have access to the internet. So I want to put that in people's minds that we know that 42% of older people don't have access to internet. I know that half the people I serve don't have access to internet. So it's not only what the information is, but where are they getting it and how are they getting it when you have communities that can't access and can't evaluate the value of the information that they're getting because their information access is limited. I also know that there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about whether the vaccine affects transmission. People think if you've gotten the vaccine that you also then can't transmit. And I think that's a very important distinction, but it gets hidden amongst all the information that gets promulgated. And so what we've tried to do is, in the programs that we're offering virtually, is connect people with the trusted informants that they can get either by watching a particular TV program. We're using podcasts because that's easily accessible. When we do a Zoom meeting, our participants can call in even if they don't have internet access. So we're trying to make sure that we have trusted communicators. But I think looking at all these different ways that people access information is going to be critical to us being better communicators.
Can I just share one thing that I understand is also being contemplated right now, and we're hearing this here and there, whispers of it in different places and spaces, that the nation may get to a point where one of the ways that they will move to vaccinate more people is by mandating vaccination and proof of vaccination in order to be able to do certain things. You want to get on a plane and go somewhere, you may have to be vaccinated. You want to go to school, in-person school, you may have to be vaccinated, which we're already doing for other endemic and diseases. That you want to go to a concert, you want to go to a sports game, and that this may be ultimately the route that we have to go. The other point that I want to just make quickly, Nancy, is that there is some work that is being done, as I understand it, around supporting persons with who are physically challenged in one way or another, and elderly persons. They stood up 65 and older sites, but didn't appreciate that there are so many people who are homebound. And so this is one of these things where they are kind of flying by the seat of their pants. And it's so unfortunate, and one would have hoped that there would have been concurrent planning to kind of think ahead about these things, but it's kind of playing catch up. But there is this thought, just so you all know, that if we don't get there on our own, that they're going to start mandating vaccines to be able to do certain things, and that'll move people. One other thing I'll tell you, there's a center in New York City, in Brooklyn, Interfaith Hospital. The approach that Interfaith Hospital took, as opposed to some of these other institutions, was to just go by walk-ins only. So as long as you meet the eligibility criteria, right now age 65 or older, or in one of the essential worker categories, you can just show up to Interfaith and you don't need an appointment. And they're looking very closely at that because they're thinking that may be the model to be increasingly adopted. And the more sites that you have around the city that are doing that, and the more vaccine availability, that it shouldn't be just based on appointment only. And you all do know that next week we drop down to, beginning Monday, persons with immune compromised conditions.
And some chronic diseases.
And chronic diseases,
with diabetes and some cardiovascular diseases and so on. Thank you, Jennifer. And actually the interfaith is actually really interesting, and I think would be really interesting to see where they landed. Just to kind of bridge two conversations, Nancy's point about information, and I think Ju had spoken to this around language. I think one of the things for all of us to consider when we think of how people get information, we often do talk about it in context of needs to be in a language that people can understand. But for people with disabilities, particularly those with vision loss, we also need to think about alternate ways to make sure that language is accessible. And I think that's just a really, really important point to keep in mind. We often forget about access in that context. We think of it in terms of language. I don't see anybody else with a hand up, and we have about 8 minutes left. Before we sort of get to the closing, any other questions that people might have, comments people might have? I think we've got a fair amount of information that and I'm looking at Shelley here to see that we've got people's emails, I think, when you signed up. So as we put together whatever resources we can on some of the points, we'll certainly share that. But other questions, points people want to share? I just want to say this has been a really, really thoughtful conversation, and I appreciate us being able to have it in this way with this many people. Michael?
I wanted to ask Shelley if she could to bring up our website with our Knowledge Hub, starting in March, we realized that one of the things that we're all lacking, learning, it's the same thing with AIDS, is we had to learn fresh, we had no base of knowledge to work off. So we made our Knowledge Hub public, and there's a section of that any of you on the call can access and anybody else can. And there's a section on COVID-19 articles, magazines, and resources. So if you want to mail into us, this is our website. Go to, this is our Knowledge Hub. And so you see under categories, there's a COVID-19 section. And these are some of the resources that we, in fact, have amassed on the issue. So I want to invite you all to be correspondents. And if there are resources or articles that you think would be of general interest, we're happy to post them and invite anybody else that you know in your organization to also use this as a resource.
That's right. Our new intern, Dia Bolton, is going to be updating this this hub very shortly. So once again, you can visit it by accessing our website, trustfellows.org, click up to the Knowledge Hub here. We'll definitely share all of the resources that you have all shared in the chat room, as well as anything else that you send to me after this conversation. So thank you, Michael, for pointing that out.
Great. I just want to say one more thing before I go. I think it's important for all of us to, you know, one of the models that I use for my organization is make healing normal. You know, and that's the overarching goal for my organization, is to make healing normal for the people that we serve, their families, and the communities that surround them. And, you know, when we think of it like that, is to really open our hearts and our minds to like all populations. So I guess when what's been started was, and is it seems like it's never gonna end, is how they separate things. Oh, 65 and older, you know, children, mentally, you know, however they are using this thing to kind of separate us is the conflict. And I think that the more that we open our mouths together to say that, to make healing normal for everybody, you know, to, like Jennifer said, something like interfaith, is that freedom. People want that freedom to be able to choose. You know, when you start mandating things and you start trying to make people do things that they don't want to do, that's the conflict, you know, because I'm a Black woman and I don't like eating the Black jelly beans left in the bag. I don't like drinking the little bit of soda left at the bottom of the container. You understand what I'm saying? I don't want the scraps, you know, and no matter how much I lived in low poverty, I want the same thing like everybody else. And so that's how we have to think, that make healing normal for everybody. And let's push for that. Let's push for that.
Great. Thank you, Tisha. That is very powerful and very critical. Any other thoughts before I just return to our two remaining panelists for any of their closing thoughts before we sign off? All right, Jennifer and Ju, bring us home.
Ju?
Yeah. Sure. I feel like, Tisha, that was an inspiring message, and we can, I think, close. Oh, my screen just went out. Can close on that note. Can folks hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, my screen just went out. I think I'm just going to piggyback on what Michael just dropped in the chat around advocacy. So we talked a lot about hesitance and resistance, or just lack of information in our community. We know, everyone's hopeful by the summer we'll all be vaccinated. That's not going to happen, especially for our most marginalized communities. So I think it's budget season. One of us, Brian or somebody who had asked us, like, is there funding for all this heavy lift that we're doing? And I think that it's a time for us to, the work that we always do is always in partnership with advocacy, and being able to show up to those hearings and kind of telling the stories of our communities, that it's not just if you build it, they'll come. There's all these other barriers that we need to address for our different BIPOC communities. So I'm encouraging folks that if you haven't already signed up for budget hearings, please do that. We also know that half the council member seats are up, right? For election, we're all really kind of watching that, because we want to know like who are going to be our allies at the city. And so if we think about education and this rollout and vaccination for our community taking a while, just because we want to make sure that people feel comfortable and it's their choice to be able to choose something that potentially might be a good a resource for them and their families, we're going to need funding to do that. So I encourage definitely folks to engage in that and approach your local funders like the Trust for support in some of this really important work. And I so appreciate the multitude of perspectives that all of you brought to the conversation tonight. And I hope that we can continue to share some of these resources and learnings as we do this work.
Thanks, Ju.
I so much appreciate all that Ju said. I do want to caution us though that we can't wait on the funding to be a voice in the community. We cannot wait. I'm sorry to say that. We just don't have that luxury. And as we saw back in fiscal year when we were going through the advocacy and the budget negotiations for fiscal year 21, and some of our basic programs and services for those greatest in need were being cut. There's no white knight that's riding through with, buckets on the sides of a horse with a lot of money right now. If we want to help our communities, we're going to have to reach a little.
Yeah.
We should advocate, but let's not wait on the money saying we're not going to do the work until we get the money. It's just not going to be there that way.
Thank you, Jennifer. Michael, you want to close us out?
If I could. First of all, I want you to know that we cherish each of you. The work that you're doing is the work that is we're all called on to do this moment. And it is so moving to me personally to see that the extent that all of you care and are involved and want to do the right thing for the right people right now. And so thank you for allowing us to witness your commitments. Two, if you are a current grantee of the New York Community Trust, current grantee, talk to your executive director about nominating yourself to be one of our fellows that would start in April. As you can see, Ju is one of our alumni. Brian is, a number of others who have been on the call, and I see Yaramis now joining us, who's another one of our alumni. Stay in touch with us. And build our resource bank. And one of my mentors is Audre Lorde, and probably many of you know the quote, which is a self-care, I'm paraphrasing, self-care is a revolutionary act. So we can't forget at this time that it's not only those who we serve and support, but it's ourselves that we have to take care of.
Great. Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for joining. I am going to say that this will not be the last of these types of conversations, even though I didn't really mention this to Michael and Shelley, but I think there clearly is an appetite for this. So I think we will continue to have it, whether in this forum or other forums. And thank you everyone for joining, and be well and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks to our speakers and our panelists.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Be well.